called inertial slosh dampers. So in the top floor of that building, which you can't see, there are 160,000 gallons of water in 12 giant tanks. So as the wind blows that building in one direction, that water simultaneously sloshes in the opposite direction, and it brings the building to rest faster. So that is one way that Chicago deals with drift. We'll be talking about two more ways a little bit later in the tour. I also saw that hand motion of this. That's a good way to actually talk about it. In fact, I don't normally talk about this, but there is a way that architects deal with drift where they actually have basically a big pendulum that's just sitting at the top, and it works in very much the same way to kind of battle that inertia of the wind. But now, we've got the Bank of America building over here on your left, and with the Bank of America building, we get to see how a different building deals with that setback from the river. Because you can see they've chosen to vault their third floor on those giant tripod legs. So you get an entire office building while still having that spot for people to be able to walk by and enjoy the river. But now, I've got some very exciting news for you all. The tickets that you all purchased to get on this boat came with a free ticket for a time machine. Ooh! So we're going to be traveling through time and seeing how architecture has changed over the generations. But whoa! Do you all feel that? I know we're feeling it up front. We're in the 1920s now. We're in the 1920s now with this Art Deco building on your right. You can see it's got those vertical stripes for the roaring 20s until the 20s stopped roaring. 1929, you get the stock market crash, followed by the Great Depression. Not long after that, World War II. So around the country, not just here in Chicago, office buildings weren't really built from about 1930 to about 1957. It's an almost 30-year gap in architecture. And so when they reboot architecture in the late 50s, early 60s, they reboot it down to its core. They leapt into the modern age, and now so are we. So feel free. Whoa! We're in the 1960s now. Groovy. With these two buildings on your right. These are called black box modernism buildings. And you can see that they're pretty appropriately named because they look like giant black boxes. Figure the people that created that style of architecture, they were Depression-era children. They wanted things cheap, they wanted things quick, they didn't want to sit around and argue about how many useless gargoyles were decorating the building. What they wanted were machines to work in. So the father of this style of architecture was a guy by the name of Mies van der Rohe. Now Mies van der Rohe was a Chicago native by choice. Not originally from the city, but spent a lot of his time here creating buildings as well as teaching architecture. And now he spends all of his time here because he is dead and buried here in Chicago. But Mies van der Rohe has a quote that I think a lot of you all will have heard before. Less is more, which you really see exemplified with these black box buildings. But how do you humanize these kind of sterile-looking buildings? Well, each of them have an extra large plaza around the base. And it's that plaza that gives that warmth where people gather to what is otherwise a pretty cold office building. But now we're jumping into the 1970s. Whoa! With this white building here on your right. You can see in the 70s, they're still making boxes. But it's a little bit softer now. It uses that white stone or concrete instead of that glass and steel. So that style is called the international style of architecture because it's such a generic looking building that it could get picked up and put down in just about any city in the world and it would probably fit in well enough. Okay, we're doing our last jump into the 1980s. Whoa! With this curved mirrored glass building on your right. You can see in the 80s, they are out of the box. They didn't want square buildings anymore. They wanted a building that curves where the river curves. So we're seeing that contextualism again, only instead of nodding to other buildings, it's nodding to the river itself. So that's kind of the evolution of architecture. You get cathedral buildings in the early 20s, Art Deco in the late 20s, then black boxes, white boxes, and curved contextual buildings. But now we're back in 2022. Thank you all for taking that trip with me. And on the left side of the river, we're going to see a building that was pretty boring and nobody used to talk about until the owners put themselves on the map with it. And I mean that literally, because on your left is a giant "You Are Here" map of Chicago. You've got that red Lego piece sticking out. That's where that building sits on the Chicago River. You can see the Y of Wolf Point all the way up at the top that we talked about a little bit earlier. And then the grid pattern of streets overlaid on top as we are traveling down the south branch of the river right now. Now, if you're a movie buff, you might recognize this next building. It's that Art Deco building on your right. You all might know that as Gotham Bank from the 2008 Batman movie, The Dark Knight. So in that movie, the Joker crashes a school bus out of one of the windows and then he escapes down Van Buren Street. Except the Joker escapes the wrong way down Van Buren Street. They reversed the flow of traffic because the filmmakers thought it was a better shot getting the Joker heading towards the city rather than away from the city. But if you don't know this building is Gotham Bank, you might know it as our old main post office that was abandoned for quite a few years before an investor did a complete gut rehab on it and turned it into office space. But now, I mentioned at the beginning of the tour that we were going to tell some stories about Chicago. So I've got 3 stories for you that I think are going to give you a great idea of how Chicago came to be what it is today. And our first story is the story of the Great Chicago Fire. So nod your head if you all have heard of the Great Chicago Fire. Yeah, awesome. A lot of people are on board. If you haven't heard about it though, no worries. We're going to tell the story. But in order to tell it, we've got to separate out the tragic facts from the more comical fiction. And so here are the facts. In 1871, on October 8th at 9 p.m., a fire breaks out near Mrs. Catherine O'Leary's barn that used to stand a few blocks to your right. Now that fire combines with a storm wind that creates horizontal flames that jump over the river multiple times. So people were running for their lives as the fire literally chased them through the city with these wooden buildings that were falling like dominoes behind them as they left. The fire burned from October 8th to October 10th, and 17,000 buildings burned down. 100,000 people were left without their home or any of their possessions, and 300 people died, which if you think about that number, it could have been a lot worse. But there was a 3.5 square mile center of the city reduced to ash. Now those are the facts. The fiction is where we get a little bit more playful. We know that the fire started near Mrs. Catherine O'Leary's barn. Catherine O'Leary was an Irish Catholic immigrant, so a Chicago native by choice, coming here to build her life here. We know she had a barn and a cow, and that the city was angry and looking for a scapegoat. And of all people, they chose a scape cow. They said that Catherine O'Leary's cow intentionally kicked over a kerosene lantern that started the fire. Now, I don't know about you all, but I can say I've never seen a cow intentionally do just about anything. So to think that on purpose this cow kicked over a lantern is a little far-fetched. But the city of Chicago did publicly exonerate Catherine O'Leary. 120 years later in the 1990s. And that was a little late for her. But that fire ended up being the worst thing to happen to Chicago, as well as sort of the best thing to happen to Chicago. Because the first city of Chicago burnt down, and the second city rose from its ashes. Maybe you've heard Chicago referred to as the second city before. That's one of the reasons we get that nickname. And those big urban fires, they tend to attract architects who come here and want to rebuild the city. And those architects are smart. They figured out that wood is flammable. Who knew? So they built the first ever 10-story steel-framed building, which you all might know as the first ever skyscraper. And once they did that, they were off to the races. So that's our first story. Our second story takes place a little bit after that in 1893, so just 22 years after the fire had burned the city down. Chicago was ready to host a World's Fair 27 million people came from all over the world to visit that 1893 Chicago World's Fair. Half of those people were from outside of the country. So there was no O'Hare Airport they could fly into. They had to get here the old-fashioned way. So Chicago puts a guy in charge of the fairgrounds named Daniel Burnham. And Daniel Burnham wanted to create 220 temporary buildings that looked like they'd been imported from Venice or Rome or Paris and then painted white. So it was known as the White City because all those buildings were painted white. And a ton of stuff debuted at that World's Fair that we're still familiar with today. Things like Wrigley's Juicy Fruit Gum, Cracker Jacks, cream of wheat, shredded wheat, dishwashers, the first ever Ferris wheel. Even Pabst won a blue ribbon for its beer that it still can't stop bragging about. Or even the way that we use electricity today, alternating current, developed by Nikola Tesla, debuted at that World's Fair. So not only was it this beautiful white kingdom, it was lit entirely by electric light in 1893. So all these people, they go back to New York and Boston and Paris and London, and they say that Chicago has become a world-class city. Now, before we jump into our third and final story, I want to give you a heads up that you're going to feel in just a second our captain perform another U-turn where we're going to be going back up the south branch of the river, and then we'll go past the dock and out towards the lake to give you all a great view of the city. So you're going to feel that in just a second, but let's go ahead and jump into that third and final story, because this one takes place a little bit after that 1893 World's Fair in 1909. So the city of Chicago approaches Daniel Burnham again, and they go, "Hey, Danny boy, you did such a great job on the fairgrounds. We want for you to redesign, replan, and reimagine this sort of chaotic industrial city of Chicago." And so Daniel Burnham was a part of a movement called the City Beautiful movement, which was really a philosophy, one that said that a beautiful city could impact the people that live there, make them more civilized or more dignified. So nod your head if you agree with that a beautiful city could impact the people that live there. What do you think? Yeah, quite a few head nods out there. If you're not so sure, that's totally fine. This is an idea from 1909, but it still resonates with a lot of us here today. So in order to make the city beautiful, Daniel Burnham created parks. We have 614 parks here in Chicago. A whopping 9% of our land space is park space that belongs to everyone. The lakefront is one giant 28-mile park. But in addition to all these parks, he also wanted to create big cultural attractions. Navy Pier was on that 1909 Burnham plan. He also created the country's first double-decker street, Upper and Lower Wacker, which was really forward-thinking because in 1909, cars were barely a thing. But I will admit, he might not have been forward-thinking enough because old Daniel Burnham never saw GPS coming. And if you've ever been on Lower Wacker, you're probably already aware your GPS gets a little funky down there. I like that knowing nod in the back. But he also formalized Chicago's grid pattern of streets and included something that East Coasters can get a little bit jealous of: 18-foot alleyways, so that our trash can go into our alleys and not on our front doorstep the way some East Coast cities just have to do. And the reason he was able to include those alleyways is because of the fire. The fire had given them a fresh start, a sort of blank slate to rebuild the city. They learned a lot about city planning the first time they built Chicago, and they put that into practice when they built it again. So you can see, these three stories, they really end up going together. You've got a fire that destroyed a city, a fair that reanimated it, and then a plan that beautified it. And all of that was thanks to an Irish cow that was totally framed. But now I'm gonna hop off the mic for just a second to take a real quick drink of water, and then I'll be back on to continue